Alrighty, welcome everyone. I'd like to call to order the November 18th, 2021 meeting of the Bellingham Planning Commission. Heather, will you please call our roll?
Scott Jones.
Here.
Barbara Plaskett.
Here.
Rose Lathrop.
Here.
Jed Ballou.
Here.
Ollie Taishi.
Here.
Mike Estes.
Here.
And Victor Crossetti. He's here. He's just joining us. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, I don't believe we have any minutes. Tonight's agenda is a work session to continue discussion on infill toolkit amendments. We had a public hearing on that 2 weeks ago, and while the public hearing is over, we're not taking testimony tonight. We are going to open with just any general public comments. So if the public is here tonight, wants to testify on Zoom about any planning topic at all, we will open that up now. Please raise your hand on Zoom if you'd like to give comment to the commission tonight. Going once. All right. Not seeing any hands up, so we'll go ahead and close the public comment and move into our work session. Last meeting we left off, we were going through the key issues matrix, and there was a section we hadn't finished. So I propose we go back to that key issues matrix. I think it was administrative amendments, or I can't remember the term. This is the last item on the list. If you could pull up the key issues matrix from the original packet. So we'll go through that last item, talk about that, and then turn it back over to staff to talk about their updated memo that was sent out this week. And then from there, we'll go through any topics we want to revisit. So whoever's sharing the screen, can you find that key issues matrix to help guide us into that?
Yes, I can, Mike, but I also have a PowerPoint slide that will address, that has the same bullet points, if that will work for you. Otherwise, yes, I'm happy to pull that up as well.
Yeah, if it's the same bullet points, that's fine.
Okay. So are we wanting to start now, or Greg or Kurt, were you guys, Mike, is that what you're wanting us to begin, or? Well,
I guess I'm open to, did you want to go, we left off with just a bit of work left to do. If you think it'll be more efficient to go into your presentation and then we can pick up there.
Okay.
Either way is okay with me.
Okay, because we do have some we do have a presentation prepared tonight that will go through the minor modifications, the highlights of those points that we've included in the amendments. We'll address public comment, and then we will also address the topics in our memo that the Planning Commission had asked us to provide some additional detail. So that is what our presentation is tonight. And Greg, Kurt, I don't know if either of you were planning to give any introductory comments, or if I should just begin.
Yeah, this is Greg Ockett, Planning and Community Development Department. Joining us tonight from staff is Kurt Nabafeld, Kathy Bell, who was just speaking. Chris Cook is trying to join us, and Heather Avon is our recording secretary. Kathy, why don't you go ahead and launch into your presentation? Your camera's not on. Is that intentional?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Then go ahead, Kathy.
I am maxed out right now at my technical capabilities, and so please, if I can leave my video after my presentation, I promise I'll come live after I'm done. So Kathy Bell, senior planner with the City of Bellingham Planning Department, and Chris Cook and I have been co-managing this project with the fabulous guidance of our department as well as Kurt and Greg, and we are happy to continue our presentation and to begin tonight where we left off on the 4th at the public hearing. One of the last items on our issues matrix that we did not have an opportunity to get to were the minor modifications. And what we want the Planning Commission to understand is that currently there is an existing process for a minor modification to the provisions of the infill housing, but we've also found that the criteria for a modification can be quite limiting. And there are some other circumstances that we believe should be considered as factors when considering minor modifications. And we have put those bullets up on the screen, and we have found that there are situations when there are existing buildings that the developers would like to keep, and it's just not in the perfect location. Maybe they're just a little too big to meet one of the housing types FAR. Maybe they're just a little too tall, but it's really about just trying to retain existing buildings as we can. And we've also found that sometimes there's really unique circumstances, and we define those as other extraordinary circumstances. This language was pulled from the land division variance criteria, and the hearing examiner has had great success in implementing this, as well as staff has been able to prepare staff recommendations to the hearing examiner. So we feel that the criteria has been vetted through our process, and it's something that we can definitely work with. We've also realized that there are unique challenges with greenfield development, and what we're also starting to find are unique situations where property owners, developers are wanting to put multifamily on the same parcels or within the same development as single family, as well as with infill toolkit. And when we look at those three, we're looking at all three completely different development standards. Sometimes they work together and sometimes they don't. For example, open space and usable space. What we would like to do in those types of developments is to have the potential to have a common usable area rather than each housing type having its own unique little private space. So it just gives us a little bit more opportunity and flexibility to do a good site design. And one of the criteria for the minor modifications, and this was brought up in one of the public comments, we are actually requiring or keeping the requirement that a minor modification must satisfy the purpose and intent of the chapter. It's confusing when you look at the way the draft ordinance is written, is because it's struck out in one location and it was moved below. And for whatever reason, our track changes did not show it as being moved. It made it look like it was being deleted, and that is certainly not the case. We did receive a lot of public comment. And what we would like to do is just briefly go through some of those comments and touch on the topic. So the bullets that I have up here are just the topics. They certainly do not include all the comments within those topics. But one of the things that overarching that we want the Planning Commission to understand, and that may be some of the challenges that you've had when trying to, consider this code and addressing some of your own questions, is we can't look at the infill toolkit as a standalone piece of legislation. This is actually meant to work with other codes. So we have to consider that when we talk about certain elements in this code, we also have to look to other sections of the code, and sometimes of the Bellingham Municipal Code. So we don't have the opportunity to show you how all of those relate, but we do want you to understand that this is very complex, and we are not looking at a just a self-contained code. one of the comments we got were the timing of amendments and not having enough time to review. And staff agreed with that. And we actually requested that the Planning Commission keep the public comment, the written public comment period over so that there was an opportunity to comment. And we did receive a couple public comments in response to that extended comment period. So we do thank you for that. There were comments related to single family neighborhoods and whether and why we're not recommending at this time that these housing types be put in single family neighborhoods. And that simply just is not the scope of this project. And that may be infill toolkit amendment part 2, maybe part 3. It's something that is definitely meant to be looked at, but it is not a part of this. This is really meant to be minor amendments and to achieve what the original purpose and intent of the ordinance as written. We talked about floor area ratio and the public comment to remove the floor area ratio. Staff actually thinks that it's a very important tool to keep, and it actually helps differentiate these housing types from others. And it also provides an opportunity to put these housing types into existing neighborhoods, and that's really part of the infill component. And as we go through greenfield development, it also is a really great opportunity to provide that transition, and floor area can be in part that transition that from higher multifamily development to some smaller single family. So we believe the green factor is a very important tool in helping to define these toolkit uses. Single family floor area and open space for cottages, we believe that we appropriately address those. The comments were to reduce the open space requirement for cottages and to eliminate the single floor area limitations of the housing types. And we've done that for both. And we agreed that those were really good comments. Some design standards for shared court. There was a public comment that was submitted that we should get rid of all the design standards for the shared court. And our response to that is if you do that, then you don't have a shared court housing type, because these design standards are very unique in helping define what shared court is. And what we want our users to continue to remember is that these are all choices and these are all housing types. They're not going to work in all situations, but when they do work, then it is important to have these specific design standards. Lanes have been a topic of conversation. You're going to hear a lot more about that later. And I think we're going to continue to have discussions about lanes through this amendment process. We all understand what the objective of the lanes, and that is to provide a place where we can have pedestrian and vehicular shared spaces. And while we have achieved that, there's also a lot of nuances in the codes and barriers, such as there's a limitation of how many units can be served by a lane, and there's setbacks from lanes. And there's just a lot that really took away our objective or ability to meet the purpose and intent. And we believe that we have adequately addressed those concerns. And honestly, that was one of the main modifications that staff has granted in just an attempt to get pedestrian oriented development. A question was raised about accessory dwelling units and why they have to be on a unit on a separate, or with a unit on a separate lot. And that really goes back to what my prior comment was, is that this code works in conjunctions with other chapters of the municipal code. And an ADU can only be associated with a single family residence, and a single family residence is a unit on a fee simple lot or on a separate lot. So that's why we've made that distinction in code. ADUs are not allowed on with multifamily development. There was a lot of discussion about infill toolkit and multifamily development standards and trying to bring them closer together. And there's some interesting nuances with those as we look at those. So for example, a multifamily has a standard side yard setback of 10 feet, and infill toolkit say for fun, small lot has a 5-foot setback. So if we were to put a small lot into a zone, multifamily zone, but it was developed primarily with single family, we would be requiring that infill toolkit to have 10-foot setbacks, which are greater than what we would typically find for the single family. That's just one small example of how it's not a one size fits all. And we think that the standards that we have are quite appropriate, and we've actually found success that the setbacks are working well where infill housing is going in. So we would not recommend any changes to those standards to try to bring them closer together. The other was neighborhood character, and in our neighborhood character, in both the multifamily design review as well as the toolkit, there are design standards that deal with neighborhood character. So infill housing is not meant to just be vanilla and be the same in every neighborhood. We really do look to the character of the existing neighborhood when reviewing infill toolkits, and in part that comes through in the infill, through the multifamily design standards. And there's some important factors in that handbook that we think really play a key part in the neighborhood character. And there was the other about public notice and when projects should be type 1, go through the type 1 review process, and when projects should go through the type 2 process. And just as a reminder, type 1 process does not require public notice to surrounding neighbors, and a type 2 does. And we are proposing that projects consisting of 4 or less units that would not otherwise require a higher process type, that they do not require notice, therefore be a type 1. Public comment was received that if there is a modification that is requested on a proposal that's 4 units or less, or if there was a density bonus, then those should be type 2. We agree on the density bonus because if they do a density bonus, then it is a higher process type and it would be reviewed through that process type. So that is, again, working with other sections of the code. That's how that would be used. We do believe that the modifications, even though it's it's scalable, and that 4 units, even with modifications, is still appropriate to be processed as a type 1. And want to keep in mind that this was really tailored after our type 1 short plat procedure that is a type 1 and does not require notice. And when you're short platting anything 5 or more, it does require notice. So we believe we've done a lot of analysis in the public comment. We believe that a lot of the public comment that was presented, in fact, there's just a misunderstanding of some of our codes and how we actually implement our codes and interpret our codes. So we believe that the amendments we have address many of these, and some of the public comments shouldn't be addressed or implemented because we think it would be actually going in the opposite direction of what we're trying to do. So now we'll move through these a little bit more quickly. There was comments raised, and I believe it was from Ms. Lathrop asking, what is pedestrian-oriented development? What are you guys really trying to achieve through this? And we're going to show you a series of just 3 photos taken from Google. So it's nothing that it has particular importance. They're not local. In part, we did that intentionally. But what we want to show you is just a pedestrian-oriented design. And so just some key factors that you'll see here is you'll see the units on the periphery are all oriented to the public streets. And so the public streets in this particular case are all those on the outside. And internally, what you see are alleys, and those are usually concrete, lighter gray. And then in the middle, what you see is a common courtyard, but within this, you'll see these front doors all linking to a pedestrian pathway Likewise, all these units have pedestrian pathways to the sidewalk. That, in our opinion, is pedestrian orientation. And so many of the design factors or design standards that we're implementing are really touched upon in here. In, you know, looking at the common pedestrian corridor, we're looking at, you know, the lengths and the landscaping along alleys. Here, there's enough alleys for parking in the driveways. Here, they're very short and not a lot. This is really touches upon a lot of the amendments that we are recommending in order to achieve pedestrian-oriented development. Now, as we dive down to a little bit more of a street level, again, what you can see, while not required but desired, you start to see, you know, these units are raised or elevated just above the pedestrian realm, which here is the sidewalk. But you can clearly see that there's well-proportioned windows. We have front porches on the corners. They've actually done a design modification to where it's oriented to both fronting streets. The porches are well-defined. We have, you know, covers. We have unique roof articulation. We have landscaping. So there's just a lot of pedestrian elements with that streetscape. And this is really a very, obviously very well established and very nice common pedestrian corridor. And again, you have your public sidewalk and you come into this very nice landscaped area, and you have direct access to the units, and you have the common, the courtyard that is surrounded by units on all sides. Again, a system way of fostering community, and from a crime prevention through environmental design, or CPTED as we call it, it's really a safe place. There's a lot of eyes, a lot of windows on this space. Those are just three real basic examples that show you some of the pedestrian-oriented elements that we believe are very important to these developments. Want to go back again just to floor area ratio, because this was something I think that we left that maybe was a bit confusing, and we would just like to bring it back to the Planning Commission just to see if there's any additional questions. But again, what this is just trying to show the relationship between floor area and open space. And again, please remember that we don't have any floor areas with a 1.0, which is being shown here. It's really meant just to show that all of these have the same amount of floor area, meaning if these were buildings, all of these buildings have the same square footage. It just shows when you take these buildings into different forms, different massings, then you start to see the relationship of open space. The more you go up, the narrower you go, the more open space. And generally those open space areas are where we're gonna put the green factor, landscaping. And so when we go back to the discussion we had, I realized this is not, it's not as great as exhibit as some of the others, but what we're proposing to do is to change how we measure green factors. So one of the things that we presented last time is our concern is that if we have a site with critical areas, which most of our development does, and we take our preservation credit that is allowed within the green factor and solely apply the majority of the landscaping score to the critical areas, we don't get a whole lot of landscaping left for the actual developed area. Likewise, if we take the green factor, apply it to the whole site, then we're putting too much landscaping on the developable area. And generally this is the middle is how we do it today. That's our internal policy of how we interpret that. And what we want is a balance. And so what we want to do is we want to just look at the developable area and apply the green factor to just the developable area. And so how we've written code is to say that the developable area is essentially that defined by whatever is not regulated critical areas on the site. So that's our general way of of explaining that. And what I want to show you now are kind of 3 examples of, we had a local landscape architect take the same plan and do different green factors. So up top is a green factor of a 0.6, and then at the bottom is a 0.5, and then we have a 0.4. And what we want to show here primarily is just the densities of the plant material. And you can see the densities, for example, behind lot 1 on a 0.6, and you can see a 0.5, it starts to go down a little bit, and then a 0.4, it opens up even a little bit more. The reason for showing you this is not that less landscaping is better. An appropriate scale and quantity of landscaping is really what is important here. And we have heard from our landscape architects that we have worked with on these projects that, and please keep in mind, currently only townhouses require the green factor score. There's only one other housing type that requires the greenhouse or the green factor score, and that is if they do a density bonus. So we really have a lot of experience with this in terms of townhouses because that's where it's required currently. And from a landscape architect's perspective, they would rather put in landscaping that makes sense rather than landscaping of just trying to provide a number of plants to meet a score. And so what we have found is that we're trying to strike a balance. We know what's too much, and 0.6 is definitely too much. And then there's some housing types where we're proposing a 0.4 and others where we're proposing a 0.5. And then even with single family and small lot, we're going down to as much as a 0.3. So we believe that there's an appropriate measure, and what we're hoping this shows you is just simply that the densities of material at a 0.6 is so extreme and so excessive that 0.5 is starting to be kind of our top, moving down to a 0.4, and then possibly to a point, and then to a 0.3. One of the other comments that has been discussed is our public process, and we wanted to bring this back again for additional comment. And I touched a little bit about that in type 1 versus type 2 process, notice or no notice. But the other issue that's been raised, and we wanted to elaborate a bit on this, is whether the infill housing should be processed through an infill toolkit application or a design review application. Currently, they're both. Staff is recommending a design review application, and as written in code, all infill housing units are required to go through design review and also the infill, hence the 2 applications. What we're proposing is to get rid of the infill toolkit application and just review this through design review. Some of the comments that were discussed at the last planning commission and also subsequent to that is, why do we even have multifamily design review? Because each housing type has its own design standards. While that is true, there's still a lot of important aspects right now in our multifamily design standards that we think are really important. There's some building design, there are some clearing and grading. There's just some multifamily design standards that we have not determined what should or shouldn't be carried over into the infill housing in order to have a complete set of design standards. And we believe that there's a merit in analyzing this, and we would like the opportunity to come back under a different process. Again, maybe it's infill toolkit amendment phase 2, to look at how we can refine this so that all the design provisions would be within this chapter, but that was not part of the scope of this project. And we would like the Planning Commission to accept our recommendation that it no longer require 2 applications and only to go through the design review process, which is the process that it currently goes through right now. We presented 2 things, 2 housing types at the public hearing. One is to consolidate our small and smaller house into a small lot. We didn't have a lot of opportunity to talk about that. We just kind of touched upon that briefly. And we would like Planning Commission to give us clear direction on that. And we also talked about incorporating a new housing type for fourplex. And the important things that we want the Planning Commission to recall with our fourplex is the FAR as proposed would be the same for a duplex, triplex, or fourplex. So what this is essentially showing is a bulk and mass scale where you have a duplex, a triplex, and a fourplex, but generally has the same massing throughout. The other thing to keep in mind is that the only way that you can do a fourplex on a site is if the site has enough area under the current density to do a fourplex. So just because the infill housing may allow a fourplex, you still have to have enough site area to have 4 density units. So that's it's a very important notion or concept to keep in mind as we discuss fourplexes. This goes now into some specific changes that we are recommending, and this has to do with the conversation of affordability. And so what we've done here is that we have rejected our recommendation to delete what is shown in yellow, creating opportunities for more affordable housing. And we are now recommending that the ordinance keep that language in. We also are providing a definition for private alley. One of the things that we talked about was maybe BMC, the Bellingham Municipal Code's existing definition was already sufficient, but after further analysis, we've determined that the existing definition is for a public alley, not a private alley. And so we do believe that it would be a good thing to define an alley. And so we're proposing that it be defined as a private hard surface facility for the use by vehicles, utilities, and or other necessary service functions, but which affords only a secondary means of access. And the important part about that latter, the latter portion of that definition, secondary means of access, the code is very clear that the street, the lane, or pedestrian corridor are the primary means of access. So we believe that this is sufficient to provide a differentiation between an alley and all the other vehicle or transportation facilities that we talk about. Here we are providing some figures to add to our code. And so into our purpose and intent statement, what we want to do is just show some examples of pedestrian oriented design. And so again, this is clearly trying to show, you know, the pedestrian pathways on both of these, the landscaping, the walkways to the individual units, how the front entries are clearly defined and celebrated, either through being elevated and or through different design features, the use of very well proportioned windows, and you know, interest in just the overall design of the buildings. This one goes to more of the development provisions when we're talking about minimizing the impacts of the driveway. And this is meant to be a demonstration of how you can still have a 2-car garage that is front loaded, but minimize the overall width of the curb cut or the driveway going into the garage. The point that we'd like to show here is that if this driveway was not narrowed, then if you were to extend this driveway all the way out, you would now have this portion of this whole front lot that is devoted to the automobile, rather than the minute that you leave this curb cut, the pedestrian has much more area devoted to them. And that's, again, one of our concepts of pedestrian-oriented development. Here we just have some, it came to our attention and we're very thankful for that. We had a wrong code citation. It should have been 2028, not 2025. And so we have, all of our figures are changing here because we're adding them. So we've provided the correct citation of 2028, and then we're proposing a table B and C, or a figure B and C, and this would be figure B. And again, what this is trying to show is minimizing the garages and the driveways, and it's also showing just a lot of really good just design features of, you know, ways of incorporating that with hardscape, softscape, you know, windows in the garage and front entries. There's just a lot of really good design attributes to that figure. The other is, this is actually a project that is built in Bellingham, and in the actual ordinance, we will give credit to the author of this. And again, you know, what the narrative says, or the explanation of this, is they're just showing examples of how to incorporate design principles to minimize the automobile. And these are front loaded units, meaning they're taking direct access from the street and not an alley. And so you can see how they're set back. They're minimized. They have a smaller proportion to the entire unit itself. And in this particular case, they've put in some paving treatments, but they also have some landscaping and other features as well. This is just a correction of that we will need to incorporate. This is it's nothing more really than kind of what becomes a cleanup. This is an exhibit that we are intending to put in that we really think helps show and identify what a common pedestrian corridor is. And that was one of the questions the Planning Commission asked is, you know, what are these? These are not the only 3 ways that you can provide a pedestrian corridor. There are unlimited number of ways of doing this. The purpose of showing what we've shown is that they're all uniquely, subtly different. And that is, here we have two pathways within a corridor. Here you have a single one where you can see that they've clearly come out and started to articulate that kind of semi public-private interface. And then here, mostly through the use of landscaping, and you can see that these buildings are much narrower than what the others are. So what this is showing is that this is the 10-foot width that we're talking about in code for the width of the corridor, the 4-foot pathway within that. And then what it shows is, because this has now become, when you do a pedestrian corridor, this becomes, for setback purposes, the front, if you will. So it's from the edge of this where you now have a 10-foot setback. Here they obviously have more than 10 foot, but that's where it starts. So what we're trying to do is to help illustrate how the width and the design fits within and where the setbacks from that are taken. Those were questions that were raised, and we're hoping that this illustration helps that. This one is really meant to go with the provision where we want driveways, whether they're on an alley or whether they're on a lane, to be no more than 10 feet and no less than 18 feet. And why are we doing that? Because we believe that anything greater than 18 feet that you could legitimately park a car on and not hang over into the pedestrian facility if it's a lane and or into the alley. If it's less than 10 feet, we don't believe that people are, they're less enticed to want to try to park in it. And so what this shows is clearly these driveways are just approaching the length where people are trying and not quite succeeding. And this is what we are trying to avoid. And these are situations that would be allowed. It would be much more difficult for someone to try to park in that space. So hopefully that adds some clarity to our intent as to what we were trying to get with that. The other thing that's really important to note about this is oftentimes these vehicle ways are for fire as well. And we want to make sure that when they're required by fire, that we're not creating situations like this, because that narrows the area for emergency response. The code talks about landscaping for the alley. And this, these are just some simple examples of how to incorporate landscaping in alleys. We talk a lot about it with lanes, but not with alleys. And I think you can clearly see what landscaping does help soften the alleys, even though they're back of house. It came to our attention that there were two design provisions with the townhouse that we did not fix. It was an oversight on our part where it talked about that each townhouse shall front a street or lane. And we added that it's a street, lane, or common pedestrian corridor. So we fixed that, and we appreciate that comment coming forward. And so with that, that completes my presentation, and I now need to kind of juggle my computer a little bit so I can get back up and running, because I had to turn some monitors off and do some interesting things. So if you have any questions, or if other staff would like to add anything to this right now.
Hi, Kathy. I think I'll add a little bit just to reiterate while you're transferring over. You know, the toolkit right now, we believe, is it's a good working document. It's working well. What this scope is really trying to just limit those technical topics and really kind of reduce the issues and the impacts that we've been seeing implementing it over the years. It's key. A lot of the things that we are making changes for, we have issued departures for in the past. And when you're starting to issue, consistently issue the same departures for the same thing, that generally means that your code needs to be changed, because it's not getting not meeting the intent and the purpose of the codes. So, really, again, this is really the toolkit is functioning well. Can it be better? Yes, that's what we're trying to do right now. We want to make this a functional working code with just some little tweaks right now. Are there bigger items and bigger topics that should be addressed? Yes, there are. And we have talked about having a second phase associated with that. One of the key things that we believe is different than or what needs to be explored is this infill housing form versus the greenfield development. So it's possible that some of the rules and regulations that we have for true infill, where we're taking these housing forms and going into established neighborhoods, may be different than what ends up being for when you're creating a new neighborhood in this greenfield development. So really, the infill toolkit is working well, and this is somewhat of a limited scope to try and just tweak things to make it function better and learn from the issues that have been presented within the last several years. So just wanted to reiterate that. Kathy, I think, are you ready, or?
I'm here now.
So I think with that, we can turn it over to the commission.
Okay, thanks for that presentation. Process-wise, last time we went through high-level topic areas in a grouped fashion to kind of stay related in our commentary. we have one section left, the administrative departures. We also have the revisions that Kathy just went over in the presentation, and I'm sure there's probably people who won't respond to the presentation. So any immediate preferences on how we approach everyone giving their rounds of feedback tonight to start it off? Do we want to group topics again?
Mike, I just had a BMC question regarding to a number. It
Sure.
just brought up, so I think it maybe just clarity. Kathy, thank you for all that. It really helped me understand a little bit more about how this was all progressing. When it comes to a specific BMC, it's 2028-050H. You just had the image up, the figure of that. But when it comes to parking, it looks like it's regarding an actual code number instead of a figure. Could you tell me more about the H, which I can't find anywhere? It seems like that code stops at F, unless it's a new one. It's in regards to parking where it just says all parking shall be provided pursuant to, and then everything below that is crossed out in multiple areas of the packet.
Yeah, let me call up the draft ordinance. So you said 050.
H as in Harry.
So 050H is our parking section.
I can't find that anywhere. Do you know, maybe you could send it to me in chat where I could find that code?
Scott, do you have your the current staff report?
I do.
I think it's on page 26. 26 of the, pardon me, within the staff report, the ordinance itself is like, not all the pages are numbered, but the ordinance pages are. Kathy, is that right?
Yeah, I'm gonna call up the packet. I just have the ordinance in front of me because I was gonna make some notes to that.
Well, it's not a big deal. It's just I'd love to see that ordinance being in that it is quoted as something important, but since we can't see it, at least I can't find it anywhere.
Okay.
We can come back to it, Mike, as long as I can somehow read that up before we vote tonight.
We will. I will definitely call that up.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yep.
What Ollie was mentioning, I do see H on that. It's not PDF page 26, but it says 26 at the bottom of the page on the second packet.
It looks like you guys deleted all of the parking sections from each housing form, and you just reference, I think, Scott, what you're saying is they're referencing to this 28050H in each of the individual housing forms now.
That's right, but I can't find that reference quoted on the internet or in BMC or in the document.
Well, you're not right. You're not going to find it in the BMC because we're creating a new section. So it doesn't exist in the BMC, but it is in the draft ordinance. And I will pull up the packet to give you the page number of Planning Commission packet that's on.
Great, thank you.
Kathy, check page 25 of the PC packet. I think that's where it is.
I think it's page 26. It's page 16 of the draft ordinance.
Right. Yes.
Page 16 of the draft ordinance, which I believe is page 26 of the first public hearing packet. And you can see H, it's this new section.
I see it now, thank you.
That would be a correct statement. Thank you.
Yeah, so as mentioned, essentially what we've done there is we've taken all of the parking standards out of the individual sections and then put them into one general section so they apply to all of them. And this is the new section that we've created for that.
Ollie, go ahead.
I just had a question in regards to your question, Mike, about how we go through this. Is staff looking for a recommendation tonight?
Yes, we are.
Because I mean, I always want to know that, because we've got a couple hours to work through this. We probably can't like dilly dally about jumping all over the place. So I would suggest whatever we choose to do, we do it pretty methodically, because we're going to ultimately have to we're going to have to make a motion of some kind, and maybe lots of little motions throughout. So just for everybody's benefit who is relatively new to the planning commission or just curious, like if we're going to vote tonight, like, and you want to see something happen, you got to make a motion and we got to talk about those things. So I guess my suggestion, Mike, is whatever way we attack it like pretty rigorously tonight, if that's what staff wants.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. Maybe the way to move forward here, I mean, we've tried to respond to all the questions that we've heard. So maybe the way forward is for commissioners, if they would like to see additional changes, to make a motion to that effect, or if there are changes that staff has proposed that you would like to see not move forward, you can move those as well. But motions, I think, will help us focus in on the areas that commission has concerns about or would like to see additional text added or changes made to the proposal.
Yes, that's a great idea. I hear that. I'm wondering if if we could have a section of clarifications and questions immediately, and then roll into basically motions for proposed changes. But give a little bit of time to gather any questions or clarifications around the presentation. So we've already had kind of a couple rounds of back and forth. So the purpose of tonight is to not kind of dwell on commenting all this, but if anyone has clarifications, we should get that out now, and then we'll move into and that can be, I guess, more haphazard in just any order, and then we'll move into more focused proposals for changes. Does that work as a rough framework? Cool. Let's Scott had a question. Does anyone else have clarifying questions or anything they want to engage on with staff right now? Jump right in. Ollie, I saw your hand.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if I had hand up first. I saw Victor's hand up too. I had a question about there's language in 2 locations that when it's talking about garages and driveways, and it says shall be proportionally less than the width of the dwelling unit. So like if on page 19, it talks about that in the general standards about pedestrian oriented design. And that's like for me, like a really wishy-washy state. Like, I don't know what that means. Shall be proportionally less than the width of the dwelling unit. And my question is if you guys can clarify that, does that mean that if the dwelling unit's 20 feet wide, the garage has to be less than half? Does it mean that, I guess, what does that mean? That's my question, because I'm trying to think of examples of how that would be implemented.
Yes, that is what it means.
Okay, so if you had like I posed a question in my comments a couple days ago, if you had a 2-car garage 16 foot wide, your unit would have to be 32 plus feet wide, because the garage has to be proportionally less than the unit.
Yes.
Okay, or if you had a 1-car garage 10 feet wide, you'd have to be 20 feet plus with the unit width.
Right.
Okay. I just wanted to understand how staff interpreted that.
I think, again, it's all about trying to create trying to de-emphasize the garage, and by doing that, by having more square footage or more surface area dedicated to the actual house than the garage, that the garage entry becomes, secondary to the main front of the building.
I think that could lead to modification requests, you guys. Because I mean, like, if you want to have a 2-car garage that fronts the street, that's a pretty wide unit for the stock, and we're not typically getting units that wide. But that's just an observation. I don't know if I have the wherewithal to try and propose some language. I haven't thought through it enough. I was a little concerned that was the interpretation, but I do think that will lead to modification requests because it's very prescriptive at that point. What if you have an 18-foot wide townhouse and you have a 10-foot garage? Can't meet that standard. Now you got to ask for modification. So I would have preferred to have seen language that was conveyed that intent, the intent to have the garage less dominant than the rest of the unit without maybe creating prescriptive measures. But again, I don't know if I have the ability to propose a change. So just an observation.
All right, let's jump over to Victor.
Yeah, I just had a clarification question from one of the slides that Kathy had with the alleyway restrictions for driveways. I was having a hard time reading. It was talking about the driveway can't be more than 10 feet, but there was an 18-foot restriction on there too. Could you, I don't have it in front of me anymore. I just have a little bit of trouble reading what it meant. So the or less than 18 feet. So an alley. So it's saying that the driveway can't be more than 10 feet or less than 18 feet.
Right, so what we're trying to avoid are driveways that are between 10 feet and 18 feet, because we think you're teetering on providing just enough to try to park, but not providing enough to park. So for example, if these driveways that are being shown are like 14 feet in depth, clearly the cars aren't fitting.
Mhm.
And if they were shorter, like what you see over here on the sides, it's probably less likely for somebody to try to park in those. And we're really trying to avoid these cars hanging over. So if you're 18 or greater, that's the standard length of a parking stall, and most vehicles will fit within that. And we think that 10 feet or less is just enough of a deterrent to where someone will not try to park in there because they'll be sticking out in the middle of the alley.
Okay. Okay.
So
I
that's-
understand. Yeah, I
okay.
understand that a little bit better. Thank you for the clarification on that.
Yeah.
So that's saying it can be 0 to 10 or 18 plus.
Yes.
Jed, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment. I think since we have the infill toolkit applies to residential multifamily, I know that we've got 35-foot height allowance for some types, but it's pretty restrictive on others with a 25-foot limit. Seems to me like some of the projects that we've seen, there's quite a few 3-story or areas where you're partially putting a garage below grade to kind of make the garage less prominent. Not sure if this 25-foot is going to be that restrictive, but it seems like it could be. And also considering that these units, they'll still have a floor area ratio, so we'll still be limited in how much square footage you can have with the structure. But I understand. I mean, I'm guessing it was it's designed to try to keep the scale, human scale. So I get the intent. Just wondering if there's a way to make it a little bit more flexible so that there might be some unique sites that could accommodate different kind of parking situations where you might have a half level down, things like that, where you're going to get pretty tight with a 25-foot height limit.
Yeah, I think the key, our height limit is it's measured a little bit differently than other jurisdictions, where we're measuring to the midpoint of the gable versus the peak. So if you've got a gable and the midpoint of that gable is 25 feet, that clearly allows for 2 stories to be done and built in that area. So I think that sometimes people see that 25 number or that number, and it's actually the peak of that building can be taller than what the 25 feet is. So.
And we tried to keep, I mean, we didn't change much of the height requirements. We did allow some of the townhouses and some of those other similar housing types to take advantage of the height increase in high density multifamily areas, because we just believe that was more appropriate for some housing types. But when you're looking at cottages or the small lot and some of the others, we just felt that the scale was appropriate to the housing type that they were being proposed with. But one of the things we did do to note on that, Jed, is we did increase in situations where by measuring the height definition number 2 of 15 feet, that's almost completely impractical. And so we did increase that to 20 feet, which is our standard height requirement in residential. So we did try to bring that up a little bit just to make it functional.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Sorry, alarm went off. Kathy, is it okay to go back to that one picture with the kind of the oval green space in the middle, the different?
Yes. Is that the one you were referring to?
Yeah. So you said that these are all alleyways?
So what we see here is these, the public rights of way are, what are in asphalt surrounding the development. And then these lighter gray or concrete are the alleys.
Okay, so then there's these houses that are kind of in the middle, right? Yes. Those are separate. And it looks like the light tan one is one whole unit, but these sort of burgundy roofed ones look like the total of 6 units there.
Or these are most likely detached garages. They may be detached garages with ADUs on top. There's all different configurations. They've done a really nice job of mixing up the housing types.
Okay, so my question is that, when you're looking at something like this, you've got these units that are kind of in the middle. And I'm wondering about emergency services.
So that's why we have the width of 4 feet for our pedestrian pathways, because that's the width that is necessary for a gurney.
Okay. I mean, what about fire services?
In this particular case, it is likely that these alleys, it all depends on what the distances are. And again, it's a whole nother set of code regulations. But if emergency access was needed in the interior, then these alleys would be constructed to a width that would accommodate and designed to accommodate emergency access.
Okay. Can we go to page 21 on your thing?
On what thing?
In your I'm sorry, I'm blanking on what to call this.
On the PowerPoint? On the PowerPoint?
Yes, thank you. PowerPoint. What I was
Sorry.
trying to say. Page 21.
This?
Yeah.
Yes.
So Okay, so these pathways, okay, so I'm seeing here on the end, so 4 feet. I see what you're saying. Okay. All right, no, I think I've got it now. Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ollie.
Thanks. On the table for the lanes, or for the, for the driveway table, what 2028, it's an 050 G, where we talk about private lanes, common ped corridors and alleys, and you have like the travel lane width, ped path width, and total width. We've got alleys called out as 15 feet, which is great because you might not need more than that. You need 22 feet for maneuvering. So if you have a 15-foot alley and you set back your garages a little bit to provide that landscaping separation that you guys want, that we all want, you'll get the 22. My question is, a lot of the time, to Barbara's point, you need 20 feet for fire access for the fire truck. And so in the projects I've worked on, a lot of the alleys we build are 20 feet wide. This says 15. This wouldn't preclude someone from building a 20-foot width and calling it an alley, would it? Because that's one of my biggest concerns is if we design like the example you just showed that Barbara called up, which is a great example of the PED concept. So you have your primary access with the new definition, you have your primary access as your PED corridor. That means your secondary access for your garages can be an alley by definition. But if it has to, I just want to make sure that if it has to be 20 feet for fire, that doesn't make it a lane and all of a sudden you have the lane standards apply to it. Does that make sense, that concern? And maybe it's totally fine as long as we know that 15 is the minimum, but if we need to do 20, we can. Doesn't make it a lane.
Those are minimums.
Okay,
right?
that makes sense.
And it would be no different, Ollie, if for some reason you had townhouses that required aerial apparatus access and it required them to go wider than the lane width, then we would certainly accommodate that to provide emergency access.
Yeah, that's a good example. I just had one other clarification, but I can wait if there's other folks who have them. In the mysterious section H that Scott was looking for on parking, under number H3, there's this, it says the required setbacks for open parking. And then 3A says the parking shall be set back at least 20 feet from a front street. And I just have, I have some confusion about that because in some other sections in the code, it says that you can't have surface parking off of a street unless it's associated with a garage, like unless you have a tandem parking with a garage. So you have one car garage and you get one stall, and then that one stall may be located in a driveway within the setback. So I'm wondering, like, this whole section just kind of confuses me because in what scenario would you have parking?
So think about cottages, think about areas where you have shared parking, they want to provide guest parking. Because cottages usually have shared parking, as well as garden court may have shared parking off in the alley. But if it's a corner lot, then we want the parking to be set back from the street.
So in this context, would that be like the public street or like the lane street?
It would be a public street.
Okay, because like we've done cottage projects, for example, where the cottage encourages you to cluster the homes around a green space. And like you said, Kathy, you have a parking facility that's accessed by what might be called a lane, maybe. And my concern was that then you'd have this 25-foot setback from that, which would just produce unnecessary impervious surfaces, right?
Right.
And so so that's really from a front street. Like when you say a front street there, you mean like the main street.
Yes, these are
okay. Yeah, that makes more sense. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
More questions? Jed?
Yeah, I was just looking at what page was that? The shared court, and it was F2 where it says no roof pitch shall be less than 212, maybe shed type except for green roofs. Just wondering, like, how do we define a green roof? Is there potential to have, occupied roof? Is that a green roof, or does it have to have vegetative surface on it? I'm just wondering if there's any flexibility for that, as well as, just kind of, I know that 212 is pretty low slope, but definitely think with some more modern forms, that's not that uncommon. So it seems a little bit restrictive just in kind of limiting, kind of roof forms to push towards the more like traditional gables.
Staff would agree. For the most part, we did not go into the design standards in this round of amendments. With few exceptions, we did look at the areas of the front porch, which in these standards are under the design standard part of each housing type. That is a comment that has come up from multiple people. Staff is open to planning commission's guidance or direction on that. We just again did not go into that element of the code during this round of amendments. But to answer your question specifically, a green roof, yes, it would be something that is landscaped as what we would think of it as. I think Mr. Cook may be joining us.
Jed, do you have another follow-up? I think you're muted.
Yeah, I just had I think it was a formatting portion on 20.28.030 under process, where it says section B1. You've got it written out as B1, and then there's an A and a B, and just like simple formatting. I don't think we need the lowercase letters there. I think it could just be 1 and 2.
So it actually it's actually really important, because in that particular case, you either have to satisfy 1A or 1B.
Okay, got it.
And we went, Jed, we went round and round on that. And then we looked to the code that we kind of stole that from, and that's the way Code Publishing did it. And so that's kind of, we're going to stick with it to be consistent.
Okay, sounds good.
Yep.
Rose?
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of questions on height and roof styles, and that makes me think more about the type of projects that we've seen come through so far. And I know in the last time we all met, there was discussion about how not all of them are sort of that traditional gabled roof, but that there have been like more modern style infill toolkit projects, and just trying to get a sense of how many of those have you seen, and have they been problematic? And is this something we should probably address today, just to get that taken care of and allow, all kinds of architecture?
So currently the roof design is only limited in one housing type. And that's the shared court. It's just an interesting nuance of our code. The height, there are times on sites that are sloped or have other interesting extraordinary situations where we have looked at doing modifications from the height, because from the public way there, even though they did not meet the even proposed 20 feet, they would have been a little taller, but from the mass and bulk and the scale of the neighborhood, that they were consistent. So we've used that to fit the context of the neighborhood where that is appropriate. Most of the housing types that are limited to 25 feet, we're not seeing a lot of single family going to 35 feet. It's really usually more the multifamily forms that are, going to the 35 feet. So those housing types that are more like that have the 35-foot allowance. Those that are more consistent in bulk and scale with our typical single family, those are where we get into the 25 feet, which is pretty general and consistent with what we're seeing. And yes, I agree that there should be new interpretations allowed in existing neighborhoods, and some have been done very tastefully and very well.
I do want to make a note there that in the code section there, it does talk about, maybe a shed type. So you can have a more, a newer form with that shed type roof style that allows for it.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I really appreciate having Jed and Ali and their technical expertise so that they can go through the nuance while I think about other things and just the things I hear. But particularly, I just know that that's come up with ADUs is like the height limitation on ADUs has been really restrictive for modern shed roofs. And so just wanting to make sure that we're not making that problem also within the infill toolkit forms.
And again, if we go back and visualize the floor area ratio, illustration that we presented, and we think of context that from an infill situation to go to 35 feet, say, you're going to get a really narrow building, right? Because the floor area is the same. And so and then usually they're not very efficient inside. You have to have more stairs. And when you're getting narrow and you're going up, so we just haven't really seen the need or the desire on some of these housing types to go above what is already permitted. But on slope sites, the extra 5 feet will be extremely beneficial to be able to go to 20 feet.
Jed?
Yeah, I think it's like, from my standpoint, I'm always, glad when I feel like that permitting processes have become simplified, just because it makes my job easier. I guess my question would be, just in general, I'm personally kind of a pro of like limiting some of the neighborhood review, just because my standpoint is that if you define the rules in the right way, then you just have to follow the rules, and then you build something that meets those criteria, and you're good to go. So I'm just curious about kind of in keeping the neighborhood type of review for the more than 4 units and the bonus, do you have any examples of kind of projects where that, the input from the neighborhood has been really critical, and I think been something that you've seen and been, maybe you didn't think of before, or where it's been really productive to the process? Because I know the other side of it is, you just get a lot of people don't want density in their neighborhoods. They don't want increased traffic. They don't want a lot of things that they think are going to affect their resale or the value of their homes, which is important, but it's also very important to keep putting density in the city, and not halting, forms that we feel like that we've vetted and that are appropriate. So I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on the neighborhood review process.
I guess I'll start, and others can chime in. Neighborhood public review and public process is an important part of planning. It's important to understand the specific context. It's important to hear from the folks that are going to be living next to new development. So we believe that public comment is an important component of the planning process. And it really comes down to the scale and the threshold, because we put a lot of time into creating the rules and regulations. And once those are set, you should be able to develop to those. So that's why we are trying to limit the process here, refine it a little bit, and for these smaller scale types of developments, not require that as much, and allow it for some of the larger projects where it might be important. Honestly, when it comes down to some of the public comment that we receive, it really is about, well, it's about density, or it's about parking, or it's about traffic. And a lot of those things have already been decided. When we establish the density out there, it allows for, let's just take a site, and if the site allows 50 units, we've already, by setting that density to allow it 50 units, we've already contemplated the traffic impacts that are associated with that. So it's to say that we as a community, by adopting those density requirements, have already acknowledged the fact that there will be traffic, that there will be more cars on the streets because of that density and what it's allowed there. So some of the comments that we get are not necessarily specific to these types of developments and what we're reviewing the proposals against. Let's just stick with this, the roof pitch. There's a requirement that has a roof pitch in it, or we very rarely get comments about that. Maybe you should change this roof pitch, or maybe you should change that window location. It's very uncommon for us to hear those types of comments. It's more about the types of things that we all have concerns about, but have really already been determined in a prior process.
And what I would add to that is each neighborhood is different. And I would say the most specific design review comments we get are in well-established, especially where the homes are what we would consider more historic, very defined older housing stock. And then people are really interested in what the new house is going to look like, because they believe that they already have a character and they want to try to maintain that to the best of what they can. Infill in most parts has kind of been benign and people have accepted it. It's the larger multifamily projects that come into existing neighborhoods seem to be some of our biggest challenges. But we don't get a lot of criticism with them, and the concerns are typical, but the concerns are the same whether it's single family, whether it's multifamily, or whether it's infill, traffic and drainage. And that's not to say we shouldn't have a public process, because there is value that does come from that.
Ollie?
I mean, I tend to agree with Jed a little bit, but I also recognize that when you get into these larger projects, they do trigger interest from the public. And when we have like a multifamily apartment that's larger, even 4, 5, 6 units, it does trigger a design review process that involves the public. So that's pretty well established in our community. It does create process burden sometimes that seems unnecessary, but trying to create consistency with that in this code is I'm okay with it. But on this topic, I do struggle a little bit with the way that you chose to structure it, because it makes it, there are requirements that exist if you choose to use the toolkit that wouldn't apply if you choose to build a different housing form, like a detached single family housing form, or a duplex, for example, in one of these RM zones. And so I see that as like the way it's structured, it creates a bit of a barrier for the use of the toolkit. So like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, if you built a duplex in an RM zone, there would be no design review. You just go get a building permit. But if you want to build an infill toolkit duplex, it is type 1, which is great because it's an administrative decision, right? But you still have to get a design review permit. or if you want to do 4 detached single family homes and a 4-lot toolkit plat, you have to go through that same process of getting design review, but you don't if you build 4 traditional single family homes. Is that accurate, Kathy? You're nodding. So I'm just wondering, is there a way to kind of create like a higher threshold here? I've been reading this over and over and over again, the typing and then the applicability of design review. And I feel like we're caught in a little bit of a spin cycle where with the way the current regulations are set up, it's not maybe possible to create that consistency, but it's disappointing to me that if I want to use the toolkit for a small project, I'm subject to more rules, more reviews, more permit regulations. Yeah, it's 1 permit, but that really only saves us filling out 1 application and like $3,000. It's still subjecting us to a process that costs us lots of money and time. So I really want to push you tonight. Like, is there a way that we could craft these changes to these various sections of Title 2025 that would exempt smaller infill toolkit projects from design review? Like if
I think that's what we've attempted to do by setting that type 1 process, you know, where you're not having that public comment out there for it. That we're trying to reduce that time frame a little bit and streamline it. And again, that lines up with our short plat thing. I think one of the key things is that the toolkit, if you're in a situation where you're going to build 4 single family houses or 4 toolkit houses, the toolkit is an option. It's not a requirement. You don't have to build a toolkit form. It's an option that you may choose to do so. So, you know, our community generally has said that single family development should not require design review. That's the way that our codes are set up. Our current codes are set up for 3 units or more should require some sort of multifamily design review. So that's kind of the standard across the city right now. We're trying to refine that in this attempt to make it a little bit more easier. But because the toolkit, when these forms are used, they are generally going into existing neighborhoods, and having that design component associated with these toolkit projects, we believe is just really important at this time. So.
I get it, and I know you're moving in the right direction with it. I don't know if I agree with that last statement, because if I want to go into South Hill neighborhood and split a lot in 2, and I have the density to do 2 homes, I can build 2 single family homes with no floor area ratio limitation, with a 35-foot height limit, and build a much bigger home, you know, or I could use the toolkit and adhere to greater design standards and character standards and things that I think we want. It is a choice, but I get the impression that the city would like people to use the toolkit if they have the choice, because it is more consistent with some of our other goals about character and things like that. And it allows for flexibility in setbacks so you can fit more, which is also a comprehensive plan goal. And we are making it harder to do that versus a traditional home. I guess that's all I'm saying. So as you move forward in evaluating, and that will be a barrier, that will encourage developers to choose standard regulations over toolkit regulations, not all the time, but sometimes, because they won't be weighing apples to apples. And so I just, as we move forward with additional code updates, looking at process, I think we have to be honest about, if this is what we want people to use, we need to make it easier for people to use this than other forms of housing. If it's just purely just, hey, we're giving people options, fine. But that's not the vibe I've gotten from the city over the past decade when we talk about infill. So I know we're moving in the right direction, Kurt. I appreciate that. And I like that you've moved like to type 1 versus type 2. That's a great change. Fully support it. I just wish there was a way that we could also create, I don't think we can do it the way the code's written, but I wish there was a way we could create greater consistency on the applicability of design review too. Also, I mean.
And we did try to look at that, to be honest. And
you can tell it moved.
And we came to the same conclusion you did. And we quickly realized that that was beyond our scope, because then we were really modifying the design review chapter, and we were no longer just within the infill toolkit. But to your point, I guess what I will say somewhat seriously but sarcastically, I think if we look around the city at our duplexes, the question that I would ask you, should we be doing design review? And I think generally we would say, yes, we should have been doing design review. So I don't want to make a process to go back to something that maybe is not getting us the result that maybe we would desire. And the only other thing that I'll put to this is, you're right, you can, in a multifamily zone, come in and build, you could have come in and built a single family home under all of those. But now, because you're limited to 25%, you will be doing an infill housing. And so, yes, you do need to do design review. And we do believe it's important to put that through a lesser process.
Yeah, and you know, just one more comment on the process. Currently, some of you may be aware that we are evaluating and updating our urban village design standards. That's kind of this first process. And one of the things that we have on our future work program is to tackle the multifamily design process. And that's really kind of that next level that we're going to, because we do believe that there are changes. It needs to be, our multifamily design handbook needs to be updated. It's been close to 20 years, I think, now that we've had our multifamily design handbook that's in place, and it is time for a review and update of that. And I think some of the things that you've mentioned tonight will definitely fall into that update.
Thank you. And don't take this the wrong way, this criticism. I wholeheartedly support the type 1, type 2 shift that has occurred as a positive improvement to create more consistency, like between the two choices. So I do support that. I hear what you guys are saying. So thank you.
Rose?
Yeah, I just, when having these conversations, there's examples given and they're in areas that are single family zones. And I just want to bring up again, and I know I said this last time, but when I look at this, I'm looking at it with the lens of it being applicable everywhere. But when it's only applicable in residential multifamily zones, when you think about the context of other development that's around it and will be around it, the design standards, the process, the review, I think of it differently. And so I'm not going to make a motion today that I think that this should be in single family zones. Although I don't see why we wouldn't. If, my understanding is, it's already allowed in our cluster zones, which is great. And I think that was a big step. And residential multifamily only accounts for 12% of our land, right? Residential single is 46 or something like that. And if it's a tool that we can give people and they might use it, and they probably, likely they're going to put their giant 5,000 square foot 3,000 square foot house on a 5,000 square foot lot, right? That's what you're typically going to see on a single family lot. But if we have more tools and more options, then they're available. It doesn't mean that we can fix things later to try and make them more enticing for folks. But if we just allow it, I don't know that there's any harm that we're doing other than giving people more options.
Yeah, I think, ultimately staff agrees that we need to look at every type of code change or opportunity that we have to address just housing and housing choice. And that's one of them. And I think, the start in the last couple of years, we have made, as both the Planning Commission and the City Council have made great strides in changing some of our codes to help with some of our big housing issues that we're faced with right now. It's a continuation. We're constantly updating that. We do believe that a conversation with the community needs to take place with this. But again, we get back to what we're trying to do. We're taking a good code and trying to make the small fixes right now to keep that working and function even better than what it is now. And then in that future, have that conversation with our community. That's going to be a big conversation, and it would take a lot of public engagement to bring that topic out there and to fully discuss it. So we don't want to, I guess I can't remember the phase, but we don't want to throw away the good trying to reach the best. We've got a good code that's working right now. Should we have more discussions on it? Definitely we should, but we just don't feel that it's appropriate at this point. So.
Jed?
This might just be more of a clarification question. You guys have mentioned a couple times about how you were trying to kind of keep out of getting too much into the design standards because that would be covered in the design review. And so I'm just wondering about the sections that are relating to building and seem like design standards for this infill toolkit. Are you going to address things on the multifamily design standards or other design standards? If so, would that require amending this infill toolkit to align with that?
Yeah, it's possible. I think one of the things that has been brought up by some of the commissioners and inside our department between staff is that are there what is it about the multifamily design standards that need to be pulled over or utilized into the toolkit, and can we separate those out? At this point, we believe that the design review process will help us in those certain circumstances. There are some infill toolkit projects that if they meet the standards, they've got the site and it works out, that we don't end up using any of the multifamily design standards. But there are some projects where we've seen that they've been very, very valuable and important to have those in place. Until we can really have that analysis of our multifamily design standards of what should be in certain places or used for certain forms and not for other forms, we just believe that having the ability and those requirements of the design review handbook to apply to the toolkit, it makes sense. It continues to ensure that we get good development by utilizing those design guidelines.
Okay. Go ahead, Rose.
Yeah, last comment I have is just, and I am 100% behind you guys on pedestrian oriented development, and I think that's the right approach. And I think there are times, and I think I mentioned this before, was on major arterials, bigger roads with bigger trucks, development patterns surrounding you that don't lend themselves to pedestrian oriented development. And I know we want to build for the future, but when you have like a big road like that, it just doesn't feel like that's an appropriate place to do pedestrian oriented development, and wondered if minor modifications would allow somebody to sort of step away from that particular rule, depending on the context of where it's at, what the roads are like.
Yes, and we've actually had a proposal on Mount Baker Highway where it's a truck route and it's 55, it's posted 55, but we know everybody goes faster than that. And so we did look at that consideration, and we allowed interior orientation. We did not require it to front on Mount Baker Highway. However, we did impose design standards and parking standards, landscaping standards to help soften, what the view will be. So there's always those opportunities. There's always unique situations, but clearly it is the primary intent and goal of what we're trying to achieve. And yes, there will be situations where it may not be in the best interest of those living there.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that is the picture that you saw today of that development that we were trying to illustrate using the pedestrian environment. The townhomes on one of those streets, it's a 6-lane street, actually. But if you look at how it's designed, that was the one where you were looking at the townhomes with the cars, and that's actually a 6-lane street. And it's something that Bellingham has not used to yet. But if you go across the border, or if you go other places, you go down into Seattle, you see this type of development on very large streets, and it can function and it can work. And having those landscaping areas, those sidewalks and fencing can really help with that. And that's, as the more urban we get, I think the more likely we're going to start to see different forms and different styles of development than what we've seen in the past. That's not to say that it can't be or it should be on every street, but in allowing that modification in those certain circumstances is good. But I don't think that we want to say that we're never going to have it, because it can be done, and we've seen it in different communities.
Scott?
In regards to that, I think Mount Baker Highway is a good example. I drive up there a lot along that area in Bellingham. We have to also keep in mind that there's people that don't just live in those areas that use those sidewalks, that there's people that are passing through, and keep them safe from those high-speed traffic and the large trucks is also important. So to recognize that to have a pedestrian focused zone is not just for the folks who live in that area, but also for people passing through. And since they're not as invited to be on the back side of the homes, where the pedestrian focus might be, that if it's on the front side, on the highway side, that to have that safety corridor, to have something in between the road and the sidewalk that is more pedestrian focused. We just don't want to forget about those folks that are passing through.
I feel like just because Mount Baker Highway has come up a couple times, I just feel like I should say this, is that, one of the things that we will be working with WASDOT on is when do those speeds, now that the city limits have been extended and they go farther out past Sunset, out to Britain, we're starting to see more and more development out there now. And so at some point in time, it's likely that those speed limits will be decreased through that area. And they'll drop down to 35 like the rest of Sunset. So that is coming. We've started some discussions with WASDOT about when is the appropriate time to drop those speeds for those areas as they become more urban into our city limits.
Interesting. Okay, should we move into motions for modifications? I'm trying to think of how we could, I guess if someone has some modifications in mind, if you have a list, if you could start by just maybe rattling off like all the topics you have, and then before we get into each one, I think it'd be helpful to have a context of how many things we're going to be discussing and motioning and deliberating on.
I'm just curious. Ollie had mentioned that section that was related to the width of parking. What was that? What was that section? Could you remind me?
Are you talking about the proportional to the,
right?
It's in two different sections.
So it's in 2028-010 B as in boy, so that's in the very first part of the ordinance. Actually on page 5 of the ordinance. And it is also, where is the other one?
Well, Kathy's looking at that. I think one thing that would really help us is if you are going to make a motion, if you can identify it where in the ordinance, like page 8 of the ordinance, line 22, it can help us zero in on exactly what you're speaking about, because obviously there are a lot of changes on a lot of pages. So it would just be really helpful if you could use those ordinance page numbers and even the line to help us orient things.
It's Jed, it's on page 9 of the ordinance, and it's under section 8, which is 2028-050 under 4A. Those are the
Thank
two.
you. Yep, got it.
Hey, I had a question, Mike, if that's okay, for procedurally, like can we make a motion to amend the ordinance like before someone makes a motion on the full ordinance and then incorporate those in? Or do we have to have someone make a motion on the full ordinance first and then propose amendments to that motion? It's a procedural question. I know that, I don't know, Heather, you got this? I just want to make sure, I don't care. I just want to make sure we do it right.
Would be fine to do the motions that you want to change first.
And then a final motion could include
Incorporate
incorporating
those.
those changes.
Yeah.
Okay, and then also with that, sorry, staff has proposed amendments that are not in the actual ordinance itself. They're part of the packet. So if we make a motion on the full ordinance, it needs to, do we need to make reference that we're also talking about those changes?
Yes, we do, please.
Okay.
Yep.
And sorry, lastly, it looks like you made a few additional changes since the packet was released. Like for example, you added common pedestrian corridor to that townhouse section.
Correct. There were
So-
those 2 additional.
I think there was like 2.
Yeah.
So we just need to make sure that we're referring to those, not including not just the ones in the packet, but also those changes.
Yes.
Okay, so we might need help from you. I'm just thinking on making sure we capture all that correctly.
Okay, just move to approve. That's the help that we need.
Gene Knutson, all that. Okay, sorry. So Mike, I like your idea of like people saying if they have any personally.
So what I've heard so far, can we start with the assumption that we're going to recommend all the rounds of staff things that have been proposed, and then if you want to not have one of those, you make a motion to reject one of staff's proposals. Does that make sense? Rather than so we're all starting from the baseline of everything that's been put towards us is on the table unless someone explicitly takes it off. Does that make sense?
And or amends it, right? Not
Yes.
completely, but also amend it. So yeah.
Go ahead, Ollie.
I think that's the right approach, Mike. And I will make a motion that the Planning Commission support all of the proposed changes in the staff packet, starting on page 5 and extending through page 9, including the 2 changes that were proposed by staff tonight.
So is that to recommend the whole packet as amended, or just
Exactly, it's exactly what you suggested, which is that I'm moving that we support or that we incorporate all of the proposed changes on pages 5 through 9 that are not in the ordinance itself, plus the 2 that Kathy added tonight in the presentation to the ordinance.
Okay.
So
And then-
I thought that's what you were asking, and I think formally
Yes.
I'm making the motion that we do
Okay,
that.
you're
So
just
that-
formalizing. Okay, so if that gets second, we'll go ahead with that, and then we can continue to do modifications beyond that as
Totally.
we desire. Okay, so Ollie's made a motion. Is there second?
I'll second.
Okay,
Ollie, can I clarify one thing? You're essentially on the ordinance, that's section 4. Sorry, it's page 5 starts with section 4 of the ordinance, includes section 5, applicability, section 6. Is that what you're referring to?
Sorry, it would be really helpful. I know this won't affect me moving forward, but really the packet should have every page numbered so we can reference the packet page numbers. I'm talking about the packet. So when you look at the packet, there's a memorandum. I can clarify my motion. There's a memorandum from Greg, Kurt, Kathy, and Chris dated November 16th.
Yep.
At the beginning of the packet. And on the
Ollie?
on the fifth page of that packet, or on the fifth page of that memo, there are actual proposed changes. They're not in the draft ordinance.
Right.
And there's 4 pages of those changes. And Kathy added 2 more tonight in the presentation. I'm suggesting, taking Mike's suggestion, my motion is that all of those proposed changes on those 4 pages get approved as a part of the ordinance itself. I'm just basically saying those changes, of which there's like 5 or 6, 7 of them, should all be approved in bulk, which is what I think Mike was suggesting.
Yep.
And my reason for making that motion to the planning commission is just that I think those all pick up things that we asked about 2 weeks ago, and they add nice figures that really help, in my opinion. The figures I think you guys put together are fantastic because they illustrate the standards that you're trying to approach. And they also pick up a couple things that we caught that were inconsistencies. So I think I just personally support the motion that I made because I think they're all good changes.
That's clear. Thanks, Ollie.
Okay.
Any discussion of Ollie's motion? Okay, we'll move to a vote. Let's just vote by raising our hands on the video. I can see everyone's screens right now. Ollie's motion is to accept the modifications that staff has proposed on the quoted pages and in the presentation tonight, the PowerPoint presentation, to the original ordinance changes from the public hearing. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, opposed? And abstaining? Okay, the motion passes 6-1.
So Mike, just to be clear, all that did was a motion to incorporate the changes that were presented tonight into the draft ordinance that was presented on November 4th. That's all that does. Okay, just,
Yes.
I thought we were done. No, I'm kidding. Okay, just wanted to be very clear. Okay.
Okay, time for any further motions?
Did you want to know how many we all have, maybe, for modifications?
Mainly just you,
Ha.
but yes.
I have 3 I'd like to propose, but they may be duplicative of other people's. If other people are.
Do you want to just mention what the topics are, and then we can go around and see if anyone else is going to be in a similar zone?
I have a small modification to add some language to the mixed housing section, which talks about when you have multifamily and infill toolkit together. I have a motion I'd like to make regarding garages and FAR when they're street front loaded. And I have a motion regarding the 212 roof pitch. Those are my 3.
I guess, does anyone have changes in mind that are similar to Ollie's, or just that they want to mention? And then go ahead, Jed.
Yeah, I think in line with the wherever we have mentioning of green roofs, I'd like to put occupied roof.
Okay, we'll come back to everyone's individual items. Anyone else have topics they want to throw on the table?
I don't have it like formalized to how I want to word it, but I do think if we got raised the height limit on all of them, and I know that FAR and there's all these other sort of things that will limit the bulk and scale, and so but it gives people an option, and if there's they're more flexible, then I think that's better. So yeah, skinny and tall might be weird, but I want to give people those options.
Okay, If you come up with something, we'll come back around after doing some other ones, and we'll leave time for that. Let's Ollie, let's jump into your changes.
Okay. So I'm going to try and provide a little context before I make a motion, and then we can see if people are interested in seconding or whatever. To Kurt's point, on page 18, line 3, which is in section 2028-030, which is the process section. There's a paragraph that talks about the objective for granting modifications. We're talking about modifications in the context of when you're doing multifamily housing and infill toolkit housing. So you have like duplicative regulations. You might have an open space requirement in multifamily, and you might have an open space requirement in toolkit. And the intent of this is to not double you up. I think just one of the intents is to not double you up. And so it says the objective for granting administrative modifications in this section shall be to facilitate a unified internal design that minimizes the presence of private surface parking, is compatible with abutting development, and consistent with the purpose and intent of this chapter. And I'd like to move that we add the words reduces conflict or redundancy in regulations into this sentence so that it reads, shall be to facilitate a unified internal design that minimizes the presence of private surface parking, is compatible with abutting development, reduces conflict or redundancy in regulations, and is consistent with the purpose and intent of this chapter. So my motion is to add the words, basically another objective for granted modification, which is to reduce conflict or redundancy in regulations. That's my motion.
You say reduces conflict or conflict and?
Both, sure, conflict and redundancy in regulations. If there's no second, Mike, it'll die there. If there is, I can explain further.
Just wondering if you would say and is consistent.
I think we have to have a second to even discuss it.
Okay.
Now that there's language on the screen, is there a second to Ollie's motion?
I'll second.
Okay, thanks. The reason I want to do this is because this whole section is about how we have two different sets of codes that overlap and sometimes are in conflict or create like extra regulations. And I think adding this language to this objective statement helps clarify a primary reason why we're trying to do this. This is new stuff that the city added, which is fantastic. And it fills a gap in the code because people are doing mixed projects right now where they're saying, I want to build an apartment building and I also want to do infill toolkit. And there was no way in the code to reconcile inconsistencies between those codes or like what overruled what. And so this new section is great in general. And I just think adding that language helps further clarify why we're doing it. So that's the basis for the change.
Jed, did you have language thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe there needs to be an is after the and.
Yeah.
Any discussion on the merits of Ollie's change? Any response from staff to the proposed amendment?
Staff supports that.
Okay, not seeing any discussion. We'll go ahead and vote. Please, All those in favor of Ollie's text change, please raise your hand. Okay, the motion passes 7-0. Ollie, next.
On page 29, line 4, we're talking about small and smaller house. Maximum floor area ratio, which is 0.35, which is still pretty small, you know, relatively speaking. That's 350 square feet of house per 1,000 square feet of lot. So it's still pretty restrictive. It says street front loaded garages are included in FAR. Garages accessed from an alley or side flanking street are exempt from FAR as follows. So in other words, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and I used the term punish. Maybe that's the wrong term, but we're giving people this allowance that they don't have to count their garages. But if you take access off a street, you do have to count your garage. I'm proposing a motion to change that sentence to just say garages are exempt from FAR as follows. All garages in small house. So that would be my motion, would be to strike sections of the code in that area, strike the words street front loaded garages are included in FAR, and strike the words accessed from an alley or side flanking street.
So you would want to see something like that.
Actually, strike the entire sentence, street front garages. Oh, yeah, exactly that.
So obviously I need to capitalize the G, but and then this would be a capital G. And so if we did that, then we wouldn't need these.
Oh, you'd still need those, because if you had a house under 1,000 square feet, you'd only get 300 square feet of exemption. And if you had a house over 1,000 square feet, you'd get 500 square feet of exemption. So there's still a maximum cap on how much exempt garage you get in that change.
Okay, I understand what you're saying.
And this is Chris Cook. I've got internet access now. I just chiming in here. So I think that this was the only housing type that where garages were included in the FAR. So I think you still need to say that at the beginning, that garages are included in FAR. And then, but are exempt from FAR as follows. Garages are.
That's true, Chris. That's a good catch.
So garages are included in FAR, but are exempt from FAR as follows.
And again, if there's a second, I could speak to my motion.
I'll second.
The only reason I want to do this is because we're adding restrictions on design of garages anyway. If you take a garage off a street, you can only have a 12-foot width on your driveway. If you take a garage off a street, it has to be proportionally subordinate to the home, which means it's got to be less than half the width of the home already. So we're already addressing the intent, which is to reduce the impact of the garage on the street. And so why punish someone who has to take street access? Like, what if there's no alley? What if I'm doing infill toolkit in a neighborhood where we don't have alleys and I have to take garage access off a street? Well, now I have a barrier to doing that because I don't get to discount the garage. But if I have an alley, I can discount the garage. It just doesn't make sense to me because I feel like the intent, which is to reduce the impact of the garage on the street, is already addressed through other design standards we're accepting. And this just creates an unnecessary barrier to utilizing the small house regulations because the 0.35 FAR is already fairly restrictive. So that's the basis for that change. And
Depending on what the planning commission does, we may need to just sort of rework this a bit, but we would capture the intent because it gets kind of messy. But this is more of a placeholder for our notes.
And I think ultimately, I think it would be important for the commissioners to discuss that and then allow staff an opportunity to comment on this.
Yes.
Definitely.
What's the status of garages in relation to FAR within detached ADUs?
There are no floor area regulations for ADUs. They are, I mean, they have a basics. 800 square feet is the standard there. One thing that we are contemplating in our ADU update is the definition of floor area ratio and how we measure garage square footage. So there is no like specific floor area ratio there. It's a square footage.
I mean, is it in an ADU detached ADU context? Is the garage counted towards the square foot maximum of the project?
Yes, it is.
No, I don't think that's right, Chris. It says right above that, it says an accessory dwelling unit pursuant to 2010-036 is exempt from FAR in the sentence prior. So Mike, if you're asking if you build a small house and you also build an ADU on the site, my read of this code is that the ADU is exempt.
The ADU is exempt, but when you build an ADU, a detached ADU, the entire building is counted, whether it's just an ADU or it includes ancillary space, whether it's a shop, a garage, or garden shed. The entire building is counted towards the floor area, and the maximum is 800.
Yeah.
And so this would still exempt a certain amount of floor area for the garage from the floor area ratio, but it wouldn't allow that detached building to exceed 800 square feet. There's other ways to do that, and that's through a conditional use permit process.
This wouldn't, what you're saying is this would not preempt the ADU ordinance restrictions.
Right.
Yeah. It's kind of a nuanced, wonky motion. I don't know personally. I just don't know if this restriction is necessary to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. But you know, there's planning commission questions or Zach heard. If you guys want to comment on it, I don't have any issue with that.
I think this goes back to some of the redundancies in trying to make sure things are done properly. And so, you know, your point to the design criteria and the other standards that come with front loading garages, that tracks for me, I think, in terms of trying to meet the intent and get the objective done, and not limiting housing option just because of the way that it's loaded.
Yeah, I think this might make some sites pencil that wouldn't otherwise. So, I mean, it's going to increase the viability of certain sites without much, I don't know, negative consequences, I think. I mean, the FAR is still going to be the same as it was for a lot of other situations. So I tend to lean more towards pushing the FAR higher. So that's kind of where I stand in a lot of ways anyway. So, you know, that's some of my personal opinion as well.
mean, if it helps to have an example, if you had a 3,000 square foot lot, you only have 1,050 square feet of floor area. And if you build 1,000 square foot unit, you got to have a one car. So you would be taking 200 square feet and devoting it to a garage. So you'd have an 800 square foot house, which isn't big enough, frankly. Just people won't build that. They won't build an 800 square foot house with a one. So what it will force people to do is put surface parking on the site, not a garage. So then you have a less desirable home because you don't get a garage. You live in the Pacific Northwest, but you got a service park. Now that's one example, but that's just an example of how this is like unnecessarily restrictive. Now that would only be the case if you were unfortunate enough to not have alley access. But we're talking about the difference between 1,200 square feet of house or 1,250 square feet of house and 1,000 square feet of structure, I mean. And that's just not that big of a deal, in my opinion. Like this isn't a multifamily zone. So most of the structures are going to be much larger than that. So to me, it just seems unnecessarily restrictive to squeeze front-loaded stuff. We should squeeze front-loaded stuff with design, not FAR.
And I think that you really hit on it. And you mentioned a barrier, and I know Kathy will be able to elaborate a little bit more on this, but I think, essentially that's what we were trying to do. Front-loaded garages are generally not consistent with pedestrian-oriented development. And so what we are trying to do is encourage to get that floor area. You get the bonus by when you put the garage in the back. We would rather see garages in the back, and there are cases that it may not work, but that's what the modifications are for. Generally what we're trying to say is put the garages in the back here, make the rules support that. And in those specific cases, maybe there's the opportunity for the modification. Kathy, I think, this is one that we had a lot of discussion about this one. Maybe you can chime in a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the existing code as it's written right now, only attached garages are included in the FAR. So there is no exception or exemption. And the whole idea there was to try to minimize the impacts of the garages because they have a greater, when they're fronting, because they have a greater impact on the overall design of the neighborhood. And so to encourage or discourage front-loaded single-family houses, we said, hey, if you can take your detached garage, whether it's in the front or accessed off of an alley, we're going to give you credit for that because that's what we're trying to encourage. And if we allow all garages to be, whether they're front loaded or not, it's in my opinion, it kind of feels like we're only getting halfway. Like we're not improving it, but we're not also making it horribly worse. But when we write code, in part, it's working the way it is written. And so I guess it's those unintended consequences. We're allowing more front-loaded, we're allowing more vehicular front-loaded design than we otherwise would. And I guess that's in part my concern. And Ollie, I appreciate, your comments about the 2-car garage and being attached. And I just have to say that some of our most cherished neighborhoods that people love the design and they're walkable, even those that don't have alleys, they don't all have 2-car attached garages. And there is character and there's design and there's different ways of achieving not necessarily what the American dream is of, the 2-car garage that has a 20 by 20 foot wide driveway. So we believe that it supported the purpose and intent statement more the way it was drafted than the way it's being proposed.
I appreciate the honesty about trying to socially engineer the design of these neighborhoods that you and Kurt have provided, because that's the truth. This is about incentivizing alley access and disincentivizing street access. So that's true. Can't argue with that. I feel like the design standards have the teeth to reduce the prominence of the garage on the street, but I understand where the city's coming from. I just think it's going to lead to maybe fewer, to some degree, there will be fewer toolkit units because of this. Because people will choose to use the code that doesn't have a restriction on street access. But I guess we're picking one thing or the other. Do we want to make it as easy as possible for people to build these things, or do we want to have more design control? That's what the choice we're talking about right now. Design or ease. So, and that's not to say all these other things don't make this much easier, just in this one particular context. So I don't know, I guess that's all I have to say about it.
It's extremely important, and staff has spent a lot of time contemplating this issue, this code provision, and I'll go back to look at our more traditional neighborhoods when I don't even think we knew what social engineering was, because they were built very well. And then we look at our newer neighborhoods, and whether they're ramblers, whether they're two-story homes, there's definitely a different feel, and one is definitely more pedestrian oriented than not. And my concern is this may take us more into our tradition, or not take us into our traditional neighborhoods and take them into our newer neighborhoods in terms of design. And no, not every neighborhood, or not, there will not be alley opportunities in every situation. And we acknowledge that in the code. And yes, there are design standards to deal with that. It's just the question of the way that they were proposed would more likely bring people into a single car garage, but with more area, or have them push a detached garage a little further behind. There were just different design considerations to assist them of trying to maximize that. So only because I believe in options, what if we did nothing and we kept it the way it is?
You making a motion, Kathy?
No, I can't do that. I can't do that.
I'm not proposing to leave it how it is. This is an improvement from how it is. I'm just pushing the city to go further with it, but that's my motion. So I think I can leave it at that.
Kathy, can you remind, I know you just said this, but remind me what the incentive is? Like you know, there's the disincentive by including an FAR front loaded. What's the incentive that you guys have built in?
That if the garages are accessed from an alley, then the garages do not count towards the FAR. So right now, if your FAR just for fun would allow you to do 1,500 square feet and you were front loaded, that garage would count towards your FAR, right? So you have a 400 square foot garage, assuming it's 2-car garage, and then you'd have 1,100. And then what we're saying is if you're alley loaded, you could have a 1,500 square foot house and a 500 square foot detached garage off of the alley. So that's the incentive.
I see. The incentive is not having the disincentive.
It's really more house than garage. So if you put the garage in the back off the alley, you get a larger house. If you come off of the street, you get a smaller house.
Okay, there's no more discussion. Let's move ahead to a vote. Ollie's motion is as on the screen, although as Steph mentioned, if it's adopted, there's some more further wordsmithing that would be needed to, there's kind of an awkward transition into the 300, 500 section. So potential to clean that up, but I guess let's go ahead and vote on Ollie's motion. Raise your hand, all in favor. keep your hands up. I can't see the grid.
What the heck?
It's 5-2, Mike. You're muted.
So it looks like it was 5-2. Is that right?
We need to ask for the opposed, but it'll five commissioners approved.
Thank you. All opposed, raise your hand. Okay, Heather, were you able to count that?
Yes.
Okay. The motion passes 5-2. Sorry if that has, like, when the screen's up, I can't see the grid. Ollie, do you want to move to your next motion?
Sure, I feel bad because of dominating this conversation. This is my last comment. I move that we strike the two references in the code to roof pitch at 212 entirely, and those are contained in sorry, 2028-120, which is shared court, F2, and it's actually in two sections. It's in garden court and shared court for some reason. And 2028-130, sorry, F4. So 2028, I move that we strike sections 2028, 120 F2 and 2028 130 F4. No roof pitch shall be less than 212.
Okay, Ollie has made a motion. Any second?
Yeah, I'll second that. And then just in regards to the comment that I had made about the, green roofs or, occupied roofs, that would null and void that modification, since it would be basically allowing for it.
Yeah, I think it would make yours moot, Jed. My reasoning for this is there's nothing wrong with a flat roof. You want to build a mid-century modern style home, it's got a flat roof. You can do lots of cool things with flat roofs. You can change the height of flat roofs by module. I see no reason for this.
How does the design standards or design review intersect with the explicit roof angle being specified? And if we remove the explicit roof angle, how would design review still impact nudging people towards matching the aesthetic of neighboring houses in an existing neighborhood in regards to roof? Would that still have some impact?
Actually, yes, it would. The multifamily design standards, they do speak to designs that are consistent and compatible with the existing development in the surrounding area. And so there's a predominance of pitched roofs. It will basically recommend that new development be compatible with that.
But in a greenfield, if the style is more modern, then whatever roof angle is desired by the architect would be compatible because there's not a pre-existing steep roof around that area.
Right, correct.
Does that match your intent, Ollie? That there could still be a requirement for matching the neighbor's roof angle, but that wouldn't necessarily apply in a brand new area.
Sure. If you were in a historic neighborhood, for example, where most of the homes are like turn of the century or craftsman or something, and you came in with a modern roof, they could use the design review process to ensure consistency and character and deny that design or condition that design. But in a greenfield development, who cares? Or in a neighborhood where the housing is from 60 different years and it's varied, birchwood, something like that. It's like, that's my attitude, is like, who cares? Why are we restricting that? So that's it. But yeah, Mike, you nailed it. Your question was spot on, frankly. It's like, is there a back end cover for our neighborhoods that do have character? Yes, there is. It's in the design standards.
Could we ask the city why it was there in the first place?
It's a good question too.
Chris, I think you had some explanation to that, maybe?
Why the design? Oh, why the this roof pitch
Yeah.
was it in there? I have no clear idea why that was in there. I remember back then that this was put in, and that, yeah, there's no real good explanation for it.
Yeah, my recollection of it was really geared towards that neighborhood compatibility type of thing. And when you're going to put like these types of housing forms where it's definitely more and different, it's a different style, and that was my recollection, is that it had to do with neighborhood character. But as been mentioned, we've got other alternatives through the residential design review process to capture that.
Like I think you guys have said, Kurt, in the past, when this first was envisioned, we thought mostly about those little infills and neighborhoods. And as it's grown, it's turned into a greenfield tool as well. And so I think that's just over time, maybe the applicability of this code has expanded. And so things that we thought were important for that smaller window maybe just aren't as relevant anymore. I would not propose this motion if there was no backstop to protect character. I will tell you that. But having done enough projects to know that the design review standards provide that backstop that Chris mentioned, it gives me comfort that we can eliminate a prescriptive requirement like this and still ensure that design is compatible with surrounding character.
Ollie, could you remind me what those backstops are?
It's as Chris mentioned, Scott, it's because all infill toolkit permits are going to be subject to design review. There's a set of multifamily design standards that are applicable. And I think Chris mentioned those design standards talk about multiple maybe design standards talk about ensuring consistency with the character of the neighborhood that the development's occurring in. Is that fair, Chris?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And who makes those decisions that they meet the expectation?
Ultimately, the planning director.
And if it was more than 4, as written, Scott, if it was more than 4 units, there would be a public, it'd be type 2. So the neighbors would get to weigh in on that as well.
I think too, in 2009, the more modern design was really rare in Bellingham, and I think we were probably scared of it then.
Yeah, and again, why this was applied to only 2 of the housing forms and not all of them, again, it's not clear.
Okay, Ollie's motion is to strike those 2 lines regarding the roof pitch. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, I see 7 hands. The motion passes 7-0. And was that all of Ollie's list?
That's all I have. Thank you all for bearing with me through all that.
Well, thank you for bringing those forward. Jed?
Yeah, I have a couple of, we can do it in one fell swoop, but I would make a motion to strike the sections that are on page 21, line 4, under building design. Gable roofs emphasize vertical proportion, create modulation, and are strongly encouraged. As well as on page 28, line 5, under building design, gable roofs emphasize vertical proportions, create modulation, and are strongly encouraged.
Second that.
These are two duplicated phrases. Are these specific to housing types? We don't have it yet on the screen.
Yeah, they are. One is specific to small lot, and the other one is specific to lost my place. I think duplex, triplex, fourplex. And reasoning for that being very similar to the other section. We've got things in place that can basically take care of that issue. If we find that a neighborhood is historic and in context and we want to relate to that, that's going to come up in design review. I'm a little apprehensive at giving teeth to things that restrict design flexibility, especially when you're going to have things going through a public comment, because I see these sections where it says is encouraged. You could have a scenario where it's not even relevant. You may not have that context in a neighborhood where you're trying to do something different, and just the fact that that language is in there, if you had resistance to a design based on aesthetic taste, I could see that resistance from the neighborhood comment would have teeth, and it would probably be struck. So that's kind of, I think, we need to be appropriate for the neighborhood where it is appropriate, and where it's not, I think that, yeah, we just rely on design review standards.
I do have a comment when the planning commission is done discussing.
Well, I didn't notice those two, Jed, but I tend to agree on the same basis. We have another place to capture character consistency, and we also have lots of language in here that makes it clear that modulation in general, both vertical and horizontal, is necessary. So talking about gable ends, or gable roof types is just, to me, unnecessary for the same kind of reasons. Because we can capture the intent, which is to create variation in roof line through those other code sections that exist.
And Jed and others that may know, and I'm thinking about how this plays into height limits. So if we're moving towards being more open to shed roofs, knowing that how the height is calculated by the midline, which is shorter, so you get less opportunity for like an attic space or that second story. Do you see, I'm just curious if you're seeing a conflict in the height limits and doing the roof changes?
I mean, I think just from a scale standpoint, if you have a shed roof and you're able to go taller if you do a steep pitch on like a gable, I would be hesitant to do too steep of a pitch with a shed and then put dormers on it. I just think that's kind of hard to pull off. I mean, you could do it, but I think that the height restriction might be good in how it's defined to keep the scale appropriate for low slope structures, because they're going to naturally be shorter. So if you want to get taller, you're going to tend to have a gable roof anyway, which to me seems like a good scale for the neighborhood. So yeah, I think it would. I think the definition as it is would work well.
I guess what I'm saying is with a gable roof, you could potentially get a 1.5 stories or 2 stories with the height definition. But if you have a shed roof, then you might not be able to get that 2nd story or 1.5 stories.
I think you could get 2 stories with 25 feet.
Kathy, you had a comment?
Yeah, thank you. So we started out our presentation by saying we really did not go into these design standards, and we were wanting the opportunity to look at them holistically. One of the ways of that staff has interpreted this certain provision is it doesn't require gable roofs, but they're encouraged. And so I guess what I would wonder is the way it's written, it says that gable roofs, there are design features within this that talk about the roof having vertical proportions and the roof creating modulation. And can we say when gable roofs, they should do these things, or when they're provided, so that there's still a design element that goes with the roof structure itself? And is because, again, we have not looked at this together with the others. And if other staff think that it's fine to delete this, I'm just starting to get, I just don't want to start to pare this down so much in our design standards that when we haven't put a lot of thought into the overall, kind of like what Rose was saying, in some ways, of what's the unintended consequence, what do we get? And some of it is we don't want just flat gable roofs. I mean, we're looking at character, and we're looking at design elements of, what we would get in more traditional neighborhoods. So I guess I would like to hear what other staff have to say. And I guess what I would be asking for consideration is something like, when gable roofs are provided, they should emphasize vertical proportions and create modulation, something of that nature. So there's still a design element to a gable roof, but not necessarily strongly encouraging. Chris, Kurt?
Yeah, I would just add that, again, this is a design guideline. It's under design guidelines. They're strongly encouraged. They're not required. Again, this wasn't part of the scope of the original project to start getting into the design standards to this detail. That was to be part of a future phase and to look at it holistically with the multifamily design standards. And if we start messing with too many of these, again, we may have unintended consequences. I don't feel strongly about removing this one here. The other one with the flat roofs, that took away design creativity and options. This one, by removing it, or I should say the other one, by removing the other one, it added design options. This one, I don't feel that removing it is imperative.
Ollie?
It feels like what the intent of this is trying to accomplish is not to force people to use gable roofs. It's to create vertical proportion and modulation. That's what we're trying to do, right? And that's what our design standards encourage, is variation in roof line. So I think what we're taking issue with is this focus on a gable roof, because it's specific to one type of design and it's limiting in design. And I have no issue with having standards or guidelines that encourage vertical proportion or emphasize vertical proportion and create modulation. It's this focus on a gable, because and we keep talking about like neighborhood character, protecting character, but that's not the most important thing, A, and B, that only applies in like a small portion of these projects, you know, where we have like historic neighborhoods, where we have other rules that protect character. This, you know, there's no reason to protect character in a new neighborhood that we're building, say out in Cordata or King Mountain. What we want to create is variation in design, modulation, vertical proportion. So it has nothing to do with a gable. So maybe, I mean, to Kathy's point, maybe it should say roof forms are encouraged that emphasize vertical proportion and create modulation. Hey, we've said we want roof forms in our designs that do these two things. We're not telling you what kind of roof to put in, but we're telling you what we want you to accomplish with your roof design. I don't know. I take a little umbrage with being told over and over again that anytime we propose a change, it's outside the scope. That's our job. Our job is to like push the scope and talk about these things. And just because staff didn't present it as something that we should consider within the scope of this ordinance doesn't mean we can't. So I think that that's not a very good excuse to not change something. And we hear that a lot. And so I think we should focus on the specifics, not whether or not it's an appropriate thing to be talking about. We can still come back later and tackle design standards holistically, big picture. Making small changes to this ordinance won't stop us from doing that. That's a general comment that I do take a little umbrage with. But if, I don't know, Jed, if I would propose an amendment, if you're comfortable with it, to address staff's concerns that would say, an amendment to your motion to change those two sections to say roof forms that emphasize vertical proportion and create modulation are encouraged.
Yeah, and I would agree with that as well. I think that, you know, that's pretty much the reason why I didn't comment on any of the other elements that were listed under building design, because I feel like they are appropriate. There's more focus on scale in a generic type of way. They're not speaking to a specific type of roof or type of detail. It's just saying we need good scale. You know, that's basically what we're saying. And then if it's a historic area, then we get into the design review and other parts of the code, which are going to address that as well. So I think good scale, bottom line. If we have a context of a neighborhood, we'll get into that with other sections of the code. So I feel like that, yeah, we could, I agree with your amendment.
So is that, Ollie, is that a formal motion to amend? And
yeah, that's a formal motion to amend the motion to state roof forms that emphasize vertical proportions and create modulation are strongly encouraged. Same exact thing without the get reference to a gable.
In both spots. And Jed, is that a second of his?
Yeah, I'll second that.
Okay. Scott, your comment?
It's been hearing the word design review a lot, that everything's going to get caught up in the design review process. And I'm worried that at some point, that's just not going to be the case. And the unintended consequences in this case, or in other cases, is going to be that things are going to start slipping through the cracks, because we're going to rely on a design review process, which is subject to the opinions of, at this point, a person unknown, and things get lost. So I would just hate to rely on the design review process or other processes when they should be caught in a document such as this.
I guess my comment to that is that I would feel like that the only way to catch things from a document like this are through a design review process.
That's why it's here in the first place, though, is that it didn't have to go through it. And I don't mind about the gables. That's not really what I'm talking about. What I'm really concerned about is that we've discussed quite a bit tonight that a lot of stuff is going to get caught. And maybe I don't know enough about that process and trust in it enough, because I think a lot of folks in our community have been caught by an unexpected, where they weren't able to fight that process when it possibly should have not occurred in the first place. And so to rely on it, I just hope we don't go down that road too far.
Yeah, I guess I still would push back and say I think that that's what we do. We rely on the design review process. This document has it doesn't bind anything unless it's brought up in the design review to say that you can't do something. So I could come up with a design that doesn't fit any of this, present it to the city, and if they don't comment on it in design review, it's going to happen. So I think that that's kind of, that's our way that we keep these things in track, and that's just the process that we have in Bellingham.
Kurt, could you describe that a little bit better to me about what Jed just said?
I think ultimately what we're getting at is that, we've had a lot of discussion about the design review process versus just having all of the design components within the toolkit chapter. We believe that at this point, having that design review process helps. It betters these projects. There are certain, not every design guideline and every standard in the multifamily design handbook is utilized in all of these toolkit projects, but some are, and those some that we do pull over make the projects better. So we truly believe that it needs to be there. Now we've talked about, should we just take all of those standards out of the design review handbook and put them into the toolkit section? So you're only looking in the toolkit section and you're not having to go to these to two different processes. So I think there's validity in that discussion. And when we go forward and make the changes to our design review process, or we go into that phase 2 of the toolkit project, I think we're going to see some of those more like holistic structural changes, maybe going into tables and formats that we've talked about as well. So all in all, I think staff can support the amended motion. I think that addresses the concerns that we have. Really making sure that there's vertical proportions and creating the modulation. That's kind of the key component of this requirement. And gable roofs are one of those ways to do that. Having the design review process there helps us implement this. And again, it's not a requirement the way that it's being proposed. It's just encouraged, I think, was the final word. So.
And that's what I like about it. And that's why I would be able to support it, is that it creates balance between a strict code and the opinion of a review board.
Yeah, Scott, I think your concern is valid, Scott, about what happens in the future. And that's my attempt. My rewording of Jed's motion was an attempt to kind of address that, which staff raised, and it's a valid point. So we leave the underlying design intent, we just remove the specificity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a good concern that you've raised.
Okay. Let's move into a double vote. The first vote is to accept Ollie's amendment to Jed's motion to change the language. And then we'll vote again on Jed's final motion. So Ollie, do you have the language in front of you? Do you want to restate it?
It would be to change those two sections of the code to state roof forms that emphasize vertical proportions and create modulation are strongly encouraged.
Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, the amendment passes 7-0. We're back on Jed's original motion, which is now the language Ollie just said. All in favor again, please raise your hand. Okay, Jed's motion passes 7-0. Are there any other proposals for changes? Scott, I think you still have your hand up, unless you have something new. Okay, Barbara, go ahead.
I think it might just be a question here, but on the ordinance page 11, line 11, the all infill housing development shall provide access to public right of way, direct, blah, blah, blah. And then it says by the planning director, and like right now where we have an acting planning director, but I think maybe we need a little more clarification on that for a succession, or, just in case of, because we're putting all of this down onto one person. Does that make sense?
I think I can help with that. The way that the codes, all of our codes are set up is that it defers all authority to the planning director. So whether it's the SEPA official, whether it's permitting approvals, all authority is essentially granted to the director in order to implement all of the planning related codes and such. Within those codes, there's the allowance for a designee. So the planning director is allowed to designate someone to do that job. So perfect example, I'm the SEPA official for the city of Bellingham. That grant is bestowed upon the director, but the director has given that to me. Just with many of these, I could say 95% of the permits that you see and where you see director, that authority has been essentially delegated to me. So I'm the one that's making the decisions on design review permits and these types of things because the director has done that. Now, what we do on some of those design review projects that maybe are very controversial or very, very large, the director is the one that actually is making those decisions. So it's when we use the term director, it has that ability to be a designee for a multitude of implementing these rules.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my question is that when we don't currently have a planning director, is the acting planning director able to step in? Because it says specifically one thing, and I'm wondering if there's flexibility in that for both.
Yeah, there's flexibility because in other sections of the code, it allows the director to delegate that authority. And that's what happens in these cases.
But I think Barbie specifically asking, does some other section of the code cover the fact that there is currently an acting, and is that different than the sole word director on its own?
Yeah, no, because like for example, Greg would be interim director. He's an acting director, and he assumes all responsibilities associated with that director role when we have an acting or an interim director.
Did that help clarify, Barbara? Okay, if there aren't any other proposed changes, we would entertain a motion to for a final recommendation. Someone wants to make that?
I personally would like to see the completed document before we vote to approve it.
I'll make a motion to approve the ordinance as motioned by Ollie with all of the changes on the PowerPoint in the document and track changes along with the motions passed since then. I don't know how I want to capture all of that, but
Well, that works, Rose.
okay, great.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second for recommendation, including all changes that were approved tonight, proposed by staff and amended by commission. Any discussion on that motion?
Mike, I would just like to say that I support Rose's motion because I think that staff did a really good job with this of addressing a lot of the underlying things that like at the very beginning of the meeting when Kathy and Kurt spoke about the reason for this, it was because they've identified through the use of this ordinance over many, many years, a bunch of little things that were creating barriers to using it. And they were continually granting modifications for those. And I personally feel like the ordinance as drafted is a really, really big improvement without really making any sacrifices, frankly. And I'm just very impressed overall, as much as I have made some recommendations tonight to change things and poked at you guys. I'm impressed with the ordinance. And I do think it's going to make the infill toolkit better, and that will make the infill toolkit more consistent with our comprehensive plan. And so I think it is consistent with our comprehensive plan and the broader goals and policies that we've put in place to encourage infill that's tasteful and in scale and appropriate. And so I seconded the motion, and I'm going to vote for it because I think that staff did a fantastic job with it overall, despite the few things that I asked to change. And I think it's a good step for our community in implementing our comprehensive plan.
Scott?
I do support it. One thing though, I feel that sometimes these documents are a wait and then hurry up situation, that we're somewhat forced to make decisions on these kinds of documents in a speedy manner because of pressure from staff, the public, or because of the agenda that's already being put upon the city council. And so far, since my time on the planning commission, I don't think it has hindered our ability to make appropriate decisions, but I feel that sometimes we are rushed, and I would like to make sure that staff does whatever they can to keep that from feeling rushed, whether it be from how the public perceives the planning department pushing these types of very complex documents into our code. But I just want to make sure we don't sometime in the future make a mistake.
Yeah, I'll add on to what both of you just said. Just by saying, I mean, I support the changes going forward. I wish we could spend more time here. I think there is a lot we want to spend more time on here, and I trust that we're going to come back and do more here soon. So that's why I'm supporting a smaller set of changes. Rose?
Yeah, I just, you know, when we were going through the RM zone process, it came up several times that we wanted to see changes to the infill toolkit to make it more development friendly. And you guys came right back behind it and did exactly what we were asking for. So I just want to acknowledge that, you know, thank you for bringing it forward. Thanks for making the changes. I know that they were a long time coming. And it's nice to start getting muscle memory for everyone on how we go about this process and making these kinds of changes. And so bringing forward small bits of changes often, I think is a good way for us to learn how we make these decisions and start to learn how we, you know, start to slowly make those changes instead of trying to do great big giant things. And I also, there's parts of me that wants to see more rapid change faster because of the housing crisis, because of the need that, you know, we should have been addressing for years. And I know that you guys have a really busy work plan ahead, and would love to see infill toolkit changes and you know, exploring how we can get it into other parts of our community, and what kind of incentives we might be putting in place to make that more adopted in more areas.
Thanks, Rose. Jed?
I was just, you know, definitely we're kind of moving through this all pretty fast. And so just wanted to bring up that the garden court and shared court sections both included that same reference to gable roofs. So wondering if we are clear enough on our motion to cover those as well. Okay, thank you.
Okay. We have a motion, a second in front of us to forward a recommendation to the city council with all the changes we discussed tonight. All in favor, please raise your hand. All opposed? Okay. Jed, you already voted, so I'm seeing the motion passes 6-1. And that is the end of our work session.
Before we adjourn, Mike, I I just wanted to let you know that a couple of things. We'll be meeting on December 2nd. We'll be providing you with a couple of presentations. We thought it would be useful for the commission to hear all of the things that our department is doing with respect to homelessness and affordable housing. So our community development division will be providing you with a presentation. And we're also going to do a check-in on how our comp plan is doing in terms of accommodating population growth and what that looks like and what the numbers are, sort of as a preview to when we really get started working on the next update to our comprehensive plan. So we'll be doing that on the 2nd. And then on the 16th, we're going to bring forward some changes to our docketing process. For those of you who have been through the comp plan amendment docketing process, we've talked about making changes to that process for a number of years. It's another one of those things that's been on our list for a while. So we'll be doing that on the 16th. And finally, I'd just like to say, we really appreciate the work that you guys have done on this project. I know that it's very technical in nature. We will be getting into more higher level policy discussions, I promise, but this is the kind of work that we need to do from time to time. And it's clear that you all have given this a lot of thought and came prepared tonight. And that helps us do our job, and the city council relies on you to do just that. And so on behalf of staff, I just want to say we really appreciate the work that you did on this project. And I think the final product is better than it was initially. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg. Ollie? Did you have a comment?
Oh, sorry. Just a straight hand up.
Okay. Heather, any other notes before we close?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. We will adjourn. Good night, everybody.
Good night.